Hey everyone, and welcome to the Contemplative Science Podcast. My name is Jamie, and as always, I'm here with co-host Dr. Mark Miller. Mark, how are you, mate?
I'm doing very well, James. How are you?
Yeah, I'm not too bad. I'm looking forward to today because we are lucky enough to be welcoming Dr. Richard Chambers onto the podcast. Richard is an Adjunct Associate Professor in the Centre for Consciousness and Contemplative Studies at our very own Monash University, as well as the co-founder of Eudelics, which provides psychedelic-assisted leadership programs in legal settings. He's done a bunch else, like developing two award-winning mindfulness courses, completed by over 500,000 people worldwide, and a whole bunch else we might get into. But before that, Richard, how are you, mate?
Yeah, really good, thanks. Really great to be here with you guys. I love that we're doing this from three different continents, three different distinct parts of the world. It's fantastic.
I know technology is amazing. Hey, I feel like a little bit of a muggle because I'm always so shocked by technology. Like almost every day, I think like, oh my goodness. Because where are you right now, Richard?
I'm in Ubud, Bali.
Yeah, and I'm in Toronto, Ontario. And
I,
James?
I, yeah, well, I'm in grey East London, so I'm jealous of both.
Yeah, good. Awesome. Well,
Um, so Richard, I want to get into the role psychedelics have played historically in contemplative traditions. But as a way of introduction, whenever we discuss psychedelics, I always find there's this subtle premise that sneaks in. And that premise is something like this. The experiences we have on psychedelics reveal something about us as human beings, and perhaps more speculatively, something about, and now choose your word, the universe, spirituality, God, like take your pick. So bag one, kind of uncontroversial, reveals something about us. More controversial, something a little bit more out there. What for you is the core appeal of researching the effect of psychedelics?
Well, as we know from this renaissance that's taking place, psychedelics has a profound effect on all kinds of things. I mean, most of the research is around mental health, things like PTSD and treatment-resistant depression, but it's showing promise for all kinds of different psychological problems. So there's obviously some promise there for, for improving the mental health of people who need it. I'm particularly interested through my work with Eudelics on its role in personal development and, in fact, leadership development. People have been using psychedelics for a long time, in Silicon Valley, whether it's microdosing, going to Burning Man, etc., to improve themselves in different ways. Perhaps it's envisioning the next big thing, in increasing, cognitive flexibility, neuroplasticity, and being able to think more creatively, whether it's being able to tap into their deeper values and to lead with more sort of values-driven leadership. So there's a whole sort of raft of things that psychedelics potentially offer us, even within the realm of sort of the ego and personal development. And then, of course, as you touch on, there's potentially something much bigger that's happening as well.
Um, we've spoken a little bit off air about how psychedelics have played a bigger role than many people realize in the formation of a number of the spiritual traditions we are familiar with. Why isn't that more widely acknowledged historically?
There's been a, there's been a suppression, let's say, of psychedelics. There's been a suppression over the last 50 years via the ideological war on drugs and the scheduling of psychedelics as into the category of the same category as things like heroin and cocaine and amphetamines, and so there's been a sort of a suppression in recent history, but there's been a suppression over the longest spans of history as well. There are a couple of fantastic books that I want to plug for your listeners if they want to know more about the role of psychedelics in spiritual practices and, in fact, in both Western and Eastern thought. And those books are The Immortality Key by Brian Muraresku and Secret Drugs of Buddhism by Mike Crowley. And if we talk about the former, the Brian Muraresku's book, The Immortality Key, is largely centered on, it's a wide-ranging exploration of the role of psychedelics in Western religion and, in fact, in Western thought. And it centers largely around I guess, a festival, a sort of a Burning Man of the ancient world that went for 2,000 consecutive years. That was a secret festival in ancient Greece in a place called Elysium. They're called the Elysian Mysteries, and so they once a year It was run by women actually, and done in secret, like I said. So they were sort of dishing up a psychoactive brew called Kukion. And this is like this festival, or this mystery, so to speak. Um, it was attended by people like Socrates, Plato, Pythagoras. I mean, half your trigonometry class from high school went to this. And I think it was Socrates. I might be getting this wrong, but I think it was Socrates who's quoted in the book as saying these mysteries, this psychedelic sacrament, and what happens there is so profound that the fate of human civilization more or less rests on its continuation. And it did continue for 2,000 years. And then it was suppressed by the Christian church, who had a vested interest in perhaps taking away. I mean, the idea that people could go and directly make contact with God and, really access, the highest possible states of consciousness became sort of unpalatable to the powers that be. And so it was suppressed. So there's been a long, long history of suppression. And there's also, of course, been, as Mike Crowley talks about in his book, Secret Drugs of Buddhism, there's also been a long history of use of psychedelics in Eastern religions as well. Soma, of course, is talked about almost ad nauseum in the ancient Vedic texts like the Rig Veda, which is the oldest written spiritual text. I think it's 5,000 years old. And so there's this Soma that later in Buddhism, in Tantric Buddhism, became Amrita, sorry. And so there's this sort of mystery. Whereas these days, I know of one Buddhist Lama who I won't name, but apparently is using psychoactive plants in their initiations and empowerments. But for the most part, it's been, I guess, stamped out and looked down upon.
So it's interesting when you say it's been suppressed by the Romans, the Christians in. Sorry, was it the Christians or the Romans? The Christians.
I think it was the Christian church, to be honest. I'm pretty sure.
So the Christian church was suppressing it. Was there a role of psychedelics in developing Christianity itself, though?
Well, that's what Brian Muraresku actually claims in his book, that the early Christians may have been a cult of psychoactive users. It's a really well-researched book. I mean, it's not like he's sort of going out on any limbs. He spent 12 years researching it. He studied classics. He worked as an academic in classics, decided there was no future in that, went and worked as a lawyer for a number of years, but sort of in his spare time as a hobby continued to study classics. And then he just quit his job, his legal job, and went and spent 12 years researching this book. And yeah, there's definitely, he makes a pretty strong case that perhaps, certainly the Desert Fathers and some of the early, what we say, more experiential Christians, the Gnostic Christians and the Christians who were sort of doing Christian contemplative practices may in fact have been using some kind of psychoactive plants. I mean, this guy paid to do spectrometer analysis of vessels in ancient Jewish temples, and found that there were trace elements of all kinds of plant medicines in there, all kinds of sort of substances mixed in with other things. And so it seems to have a pretty central place in early Western and Eastern thought.
Why? What were they getting from using them that made them central?
Yeah, it's a really interesting question, isn't it? Why would people why would people do that? Why would that be so widely used? And I mean, there are so many. It's shrouded in mystery. No one knows for sure. There are hypotheses. There are speculations. I mean, my intuitive sense is that they provide us access to something that is so far beyond our ordinary world that it perhaps gives us it gives us a really sort of big picture view of perhaps what's possible in terms of human potential, or even into the nature, insights into the nature of human consciousness, and what it is ultimately to be human. And so perhaps it's just a very powerful tool. I mean, certainly people talk about that, even today, using it as a very powerful tool, not just for for improving health and well-being, but also for insights into the nature of consciousness.
Richard, are you involved in the science here as well? Like, are you in touch with the research about sort of what's happening at the, perhaps even at the brain level or nervous system level when we're taking psychedelics that might have this sort of bang on effect of opening the gates of perception? Are you in touch with that research? Because it would be great to hear a little bit about, like, what do we know today from our science about why this might be as useful as you say it is?
Yeah, well, I am. I'm heavily involved in research, actually, both through some work at Monash University with one of the labs there, and also through Eudelics, my psychedelic retreat company, where one of our founders is a postdoctoral researcher in both mindfulness and psychedelics, and so we're actively doing quite a lot of research. When it comes to psychedelics and neuroimaging, psychedelics and brain activity, there's very little that we know at the moment. Um, I'm collaborating on a project with Adil Razi at Monash University and Devon Stolica, and so we are. It's called PsyConnect. So we're getting normal population of people, so non-clinical population, giving them a moderate to high dose of psilocybin, and then putting them in an EEG and then in MRI, and just tracking them while they listen to music and allow their brain to rest, etc. That's all. I mean, we haven't analyzed any data yet. There's certainly nothing I can share with you, unfortunately, because it really is in the early days. And then there, of course, is a whole lot of clinical research. At the moment, the research we're doing in Eudelics is cross-sectional. So we're looking at the association between lifetime use of psychedelics and a range of positive outcomes like healthy behaviors, as well as a range of potentially adverse consequences, some of the risk factors, epilepsy, seizures, things like that.
Yeah, that's fantastic. I imagine you know Robin Carhart Harris's recent work on this as well. I'm very attracted to this approach that maybe what psychedelics might be doing, at least psychedelics like psilocybin, is they might be heating the brain up, adding some volatility, some uncertainty into the system. And that's really valuable, especially since things like depression or anxiety are really certain subsets. Like you are certain that the world isn't working, you're certain that the world is dangerous. And so it can be really valuable to sort of heat those habit styles of thinking up so that they become more malleable again, they become more fluid. And I love that, like thinking about pathology as a kind of rigidity. I think that's probably
Yes.
right. And that health has something to do with fluidity. And I don't know, just thinking along those lines, like thinking about psilocybin as increasing entropy or uncertainty in the brain. I don't know, I heard it when you said maybe Socrates hung out at these mysteries. Because Socrates is sort of widely known as the philosopher who really kept trying to generate more uncertainty in people, right? He'd say, well, why are you
Yeah.
going to work? Tell me about that. And why do you think money's important? Tell me about that. And that's the same thing as I think the psilocybin is sort of doing in a way. You're increasing uncertainty. Why? Because it's the fact that you have too much certainty that's blinding you
Yes.
from all of the other ways you could be. And if you could just get a little bit more uncertainty into the system, you just might bump out of that and into a neighboring pocket that might be much better for you. So I love that. There's like a kind of value of uncertainty, and maybe psychedelics are playing a role there.
I think it's a fantastic point. I mean, some of the most interesting theories for me are around the neuroplasticity that psychedelics engender. I mean, it just makes the brain extremely plastic and open to new ways of thinking and acting for a period of time. There's a window, a few weeks after a big dose of any psychedelic. And then also the idea that it might be just suspending the higher order brain processing, so that those belief systems that, as you point out, Mark, sort of constrain us. We're obviously bombarded with so much sensory stimulation that we can't process everything that's coming in. So the brain just starts to take shortcuts and just apply heuristics and apply sort of fixed frameworks to things. We make assumptions. We start to ignore quite, large amounts of information that are coming at us. And psychedelics suspend the belief systems that help us to do that. So we do get flooded during high dose psychedelic experiences. We do get very flooded and bombarded with all kinds of sensory and mental and emotional experiences. And that's potentially actually a really good thing because it just shakes up the snow dome. I forget whose metaphor it is. It might actually be Robin Carhart Harris's metaphor of snow falling on a mountain. You know, you've got the tracks that everyone's been skiing down. There are neural pathways in our belief systems and our habits. And then all of a sudden there's this big dump of fresh snow. And when you're at the top of that mountain with, a whole bunch of fresh snow that's fallen, then anything's possible. You can ski any way that you like and start to lay down new tracks. And that's potentially, again, what's happening.
So when you say shake up the snow dome, that makes me nervous. What are the drawbacks of shaking up the snow dome?
The potential drawbacks, of course, of shaking up the snow dome is that anything becomes possible. And of course, we know that psychedelics are a non-specific amplifier, for instance. It's not that they inherently lead people to being more ethical, more connected with nature, more connected with themselves. I mean, there are, few but quite poignant examples of far right-wing groups using certain psychedelics as part of their indoctrination rituals, I guess, hazing rituals to help people to, think more alike with them. I mean, it really depends on how it's used. It's a non-specific amplifier, which again, of course, that speaks to the value of set and setting. Doing it in the right setting and doing it with the right mindset and also the right intention. And so certainly what we're doing at Eudelics with our leadership programs is we're creating a container. It's an 8-week course. So it's 4 weeks of mindfulness-based preparation training. Well, first of all, it's a psych and medical screen to make sure that no one's getting into the program that isn't going to benefit from it. Then it's 4 weeks of fairly intensive training in mindfulness to prepare them for psychedelic experiences. Then it's a 5-day retreat in a setting like in the Netherlands actually at the moment, and that's psilocybin truffles are legal there, but not the mushrooms that grow above the ground. Go figure. And there are 2 ceremonies facilitated by trained psychedelic therapists, and then there's 4 weeks of integration training. And so we create a container to ensure that anybody who's doing that program is hopefully setting a clear intention, doing it in an ethical way, that they're safe, that they're part of a community of people who are doing it sort of for similar reasons, that they're then, spending time in nature, connecting with one another, connecting with themselves. And so when it's done in a comprehensive container like that, it maximizes the likelihood that people are going to get benefits from that, expand and grow and hopefully become more ethical and more impactful in their leadership. But of course, it's not it's possible that, I mean, anything can happen. Let's be honest. If someone just goes and takes psychedelics recreationally, anything can happen. We shake up that snow dome and all
Yeah.
sorts of things can happen. Mental health problems can emerge, negative experience, challenging experiences can emerge, which can lead to mental health problems. People can get more
Yeah.
and more entrenched in their stiff ideas, whether it's far right-wing ideologies or narcissism or, just erroneous beliefs. And of course, with all that neuroplasticity and the profundity of the experience, we know that sometimes people do hold on very rigidly to very wrong and very maladaptive ideas coming out of psychedelic experiences.
Yeah, wow. So you've got this increase, potentially you've got this increase in uncertainty, valuable. Pushes you into insight, brings down boundaries, opens up the vista. But the other half of that story has to be, now that you're in the wide open, where do you settle again? Like when the system cools back down, what shape does it cool back down into? And I love that so far the story we've been telling, maybe it's not exactly like this, but I like the story that these things were, all of the examples you gave of where this is being used really effectively to help humans, they were part of a tradition. They were part of a long chain where you have elders and you have a community and you have teachings, and these things are being used within that container, and that makes a lot of sense to me. So that you're already on a path that's going to hopefully lead to a sort of better human life, and then psychedelics are being used as well, whatever they are, as little engines or little operators along the way. If you take away the path and you just create a bunch of uncertainty, then you're sort of shuffling the deck. I mean, who knows what the shuffle is going to come out to. And I know you say there are some like inherently good things that come, and I think that's definitely that's at least anecdotally what I've heard from people that I know that are in this scene. But again, if it is just increased entropy, then if you have sort of parasitic ideologies, they can use that entropy, right? They can say, look, you didn't know, but now I'm going to tell you. I'm going to tell you how it is. It's like this. And then maybe the system cools back down into a shape that's not so valuable. So I love to hear that you have this like sort of rigorous program. That's the first time I've actually heard of a program like that. So I'm a bit of I'm known as a sober spiritual teacher. I talk in sort of psychedelic spaces occasionally, and I'm always the voice. It seems to be. I'm a little bit off to the edge, saying, I think we should do more progressive practice. I think if you take these things bit by bit and develop your mind slowly and develop your heart slowly, then you're going to be in a safer territory, and then these things can be little accents. So I love to hear that you have a training program where people literally come and train themselves to prepare, and then they use it as a hi-hat, and then they cool out of it. I mean, that sounds right to me.
Yeah, it is. It's very important, and as you point out, Mark, I mean, traditionally, psychedelics and plant medicines have been used in very well-defined containers. They've been used for specific purposes, mainly for healing. They've been used in very well-defined containers, and so we need to be recreating that, and that's what all of the skillful psychedelic therapists and researchers and practitioners are doing. They're making sure that container is one that's going to produce beneficial outcomes for people. And of course, we want to be really careful during the process as well, during the psychedelic ceremonies, to be non-interventive really. And that's the art of psychedelic therapy, is to be present and to help to steer that journey, but also to not influence it in a way that perhaps gets in the way of the natural unfolding of the psychedelic process, which, left to its own devices in a safe container with the right set and setting, is generally very benevolent and beneficial. I mean, mostly if we just let it ride and people don't resist the psychedelic process, that's where we bump into problems, when people are anxious or afraid of and then resist what's coming up, what's happening. That's usually when people start to develop what's called anxious ego dissolution, as opposed to the more positive states of ego dissolution. And not that ego dissolution, of course, is the only useful thing that happens in psychedelics, but my point is that if we resist it, or if it's steered in a direction that's perhaps not where it needs to go, then that can actually get in the way of it doing its magic.
It's not unique to psychedelics here either. We see the same thing, I think, in the meditation community today as well. So
Yep.
you have people doing, deep, fast, high practices without having the proper base and without being set in a particular tradition, and they're having anxious ego dissolution experiences because they haven't cultivated a strong enough sense of loving kindness. They haven't developed a strong enough sense of faith. They're not in a place where they can feel safe to let go, and yet they're supercharging attentional programs that challenge who they think they are. And you might think that over time that'll be valuable if they if they can swing back to center, but I think it's a bit reckless actually to do that without having some sort of without having the kinds of stability making practices and traditions in play. Then just sort of pumping inside seems a bit precarious in most circumstances. So I just mean to say it's not like this is only happening in psychedelics. We're seeing this a lot in various kinds of spiritual developmental programs, I think.
Yeah, it's a great point. And there are, as you said, strong parallels. I've been practicing mindfulness meditation for 23 years, and using plant medicines for slightly longer than that. And I've been teaching mindfulness for almost 20 years, and I'm familiar. It's very similar. In fact, what I've learned through being a meditation teacher over the last couple of decades is actually helping me a lot as I become a psychedelic facilitator as well.
So, you know, um, it's interesting, right? So there's this quote that I like. Some think that the burning bush that allowed Moses to hear God's voice was actually an indigenous plant that contains DMT. Dr. Rick Strassman, in his book DMT, The Spiritual Molecule, theorized that DMT is actually the gateway through which our souls enter and leave our bodies, as we can observe a large release of DMT in the brain during times of birth, death, and when the embryo is 7 weeks old, which is when it starts differentiating into male or female. So, anyway, there's a couple of examples. DMT pops up all the time. Near-death experiences, DMT. Childbirth, DMT. Is there any spiritual significance in your view to DMT as a chemical?
Well, look, there seems to be. I mean, if we look at the scriptures, I mean, there is certainly something that, whether that's true or not, whether the burning bush was in fact a burning bush of DMT, whether that's perhaps a metaphor for something else. I mean, it's very hard to know, isn't it? It's very hard to know. But there's certainly something in the experience of using DMT that it really does take us so far beyond the the normal grounded human experience. A metaphor that I like to use for psychedelics and also for meditation, which I think go together beautifully, by the way. I mean, I wrote a paper I published at the start of last year with Paul Ignatski from Monash University and another friend of mine, Jake Payne, these bidirectional synergies between mindfulness meditation and psychedelics are pretty obvious. But the metaphor that I really like is the elevator to the penthouse, right? I mean, psychedelics in a way, and particularly something like DMT, it's literally like taking the elevator up to the penthouse and the doors open and we get this profound view that goes so far beyond anything that we could ever, have imagined, anything we've experienced up to that point. This sense of just limitless consciousness. I mean, it's ineffable basically, but you can imagine this huge view. And for a time, we get to enjoy that. And then the doors close and the elevator takes us down into the basement. And people and a lot of people, keep taking that elevator. And of course, once we've seen that, we're fundamentally different, in some ways, because you can never unsee it. And there's a different perspective and a different awareness of what is actually potentially happening beyond our limiting beliefs and perceptual filters. But it's then really important after a while to realize that, oh, hang on a sec, there's a stairwell here, and that's the meditation practice. And to take those stairs, and what we argued in our paper, we actually used a different metaphor, so I'm mixing metaphors here, of the compass and the vehicle. But it's the same thing. One shows us what's possible and the direction that we might head in, and that's the psychedelics. That's the elevator, or it's the compass pointing our way, and then the vehicle itself is meditation practice. And it's again, just to talk about that other book I mentioned, Mike Crowley's Secret Drugs of Buddhism. I mean, synopsis of the book is that in the ancient Hindu text, they talk about this plant medicine or this some kind of concoction, soma, and there's a lot of conjecture about what that might have been, whether it was one thing, whether it was a whole bunch of different things over time. But there was definitely a psychedelic sacrament that was being used in different Hindu rituals, fire ritual, etc. And then over time, that became a placebo. I mean, it's still used in certain Hindu rituals, but these days it's water with, flower petals floating in it, and it's certainly not doing anything psychoactively. And then Hinduism was actually rebranded into Buddhism, and that's really interesting. This Mike Crowley is a Buddhist Lama, as well as a friend of Anne Shulgin's, and a psychedelic aficionado. And he makes a very compelling case that Hinduism was in some sense rebranded, and we know that a lot of particularly the tantric practices in Buddhism share common ancestry with some of the Advaitic and tantric Hindu practices. The iconography, I mean, Avalokiteshvara is actually potentially Ishvara, which is another name for Shiva. When I used to do the Yidam practice, I've done Vajrayana Buddhist practices I did for about 10 or 11 years. And one of my favorite practices was loving eyes or Chenrezig practice, the Buddha of compassion. And there was always, and part of the visualization is there's a deer skin draped over his left shoulder. And that signifies that he possesses the kindness of a deer and will never harm anyone. And I always used to think, that's weird. Why would you have a skinned animal if you're, and of course you dig far enough, and Shiva had a bow and arrow, and used to hunt deer. And so that's potentially, where some of that iconography's come from. So there's this continuation anyway. And then Amrita in Buddhist, I've drank Amrita in Buddhist empowerments and initiations. And again, it's water with sort of grains of rice or flowers floating, and it doesn't do anything. But Mike Crowley makes the point that potentially that was a sacrament that was central to empowerments. Potentially, people would drink with a lama, meditate, get profound, access to one of these practices, and then continue that practice again, taking the stairs and heading in the direction of, in this case, cultivating compassion and wisdom.
So the psychedelic turns out to be part of the pith instruction, as they say, where you
That's
sit with the
correct.
teacher and
Yeah.
they point out the way, and then it's your job to practice to that point going forward.
It's a really interesting point here, because as you mentioned, sort of a range of different traditions, it gets me wondering. We're speaking today about how different spiritual traditions all use psychedelics, and if our initial premise is roughly true, that they tell us something about ourselves, or maybe more ambitiously, something about the universe, you would expect these traditions to come to similar conclusions, right? About psychedelics, or rather, what is revealed by psychedelics. To what degree is there consensus on the fruit of the experimentation across traditions and cultures?
I don't think look, I'm not an expert on all of the sort of indigenous or traditional uses of psychedelics by any means, but by my understanding, there's no consensus. There seems to be all kinds of different experiences, different ways of describing it. Certainly within psychedelic literature, the modern psychedelic research, it's not just that we have ego dissolution. People access all kinds of different, psychological levels, I guess you would say, archetypal levels. People describe them as different realms, and so there's an incredible range, a sort of plethora of different experiences that people have when they use psychedelics. I'm particularly interested myself. Anytime I do a plant medicine ceremony, I'm using it to increase, to increase my meditative depth. I find it's very helpful actually as an adjunct to meditation, to just sort of, I guess, shut down the default mode network and provide access to what is beyond that in a way that meditation was already doing, but it just kind of fast forwards that. So I'm particularly interested in ego dissolution and beyond the ego states, whether it's through meditation practice, whether it's through, the use of psychedelics. And I think when you're within that realm, there seems to be some kind of commonality. That's certainly my intuition anyway, that if people are using it for that purpose and that's the intention, I don't know, whether it's sort of Kukion in ancient Greece or whether it's some ayahuasca in Central America, I imagine that people are probably having fairly similar experiences when it comes to ego dissolution. But then there are, as I said, there are all these other things, people tapping into all kinds of, or different types of wisdom or healing different types of psycho-spiritual illnesses. So there's some variation there, but certainly when the way I teach it, the way I'm interested in using it myself, it's about ego dissolution and being able to sort of get a glimpse of what is beyond the limitations of thinking.
Yeah, and it actually makes sense as well, because if you use the snow globe analogy, it makes sense that in both cases you're shaking it up, hence the ego dissolution. But obviously, what was previously on the mountain matters, right? So if you have a different cultural context or a different psychological context, it seems obvious that you're going to have a different experience when you shake it all up than someone with a totally different kind of brain.
It would make sense, wouldn't it? And it would depend exactly what was there to start with.
The question then emerges: if someone is to want to sort of dip into the world of taking psychedelics, under what conditions and for what outcome do you suggest they do so?
Well, first of all, I guess I don't want to condone illegal use of psychedelics. Unfortunately, we are still under the influence of a 50-year ideological war on plants. as crazy as that is. And it does seem to be thawing, and there are some, some great examples of places around the world where that's being relaxed and loosened, driven in no small part by the renaissance of psychological or sort of psychedelic research. Um, but of course, I acknowledge that people are all over the world using psychedelics, yeah, for recreational purposes, for personal development, for their own healing, outside of clinical trials and clinical settings. So there are a few basic principles. I mean, if anyone wants to jump on Eudelics, eudelics.com on our website, they'll find a guide that I wrote for using psychedelics safely. I mean, you want to prepare yourself. You want to be in the right, what's called, the right set and setting. So the right set means to be in the right mindset. I would strongly recommend doing some meditation at least before ingesting any psychedelics, and ideally for a number of weeks beforehand. I would recommend mindfulness meditation. That's what the research seems to be mainly in support of these days. And, the ability to stay present and non-reactive, no matter what's coming up, is a fantastic tool, particularly if anyone wants to take, moderate to high doses of psychedelics, because all sorts of stuff can come up. And what we know, as I said before, is if they're a challenging experience, I mean, sometimes it's just blissful. Sometimes it's just the most blissful experience. And if that's what's happening, that's a blessing. Enjoy it. Fantastic. Sometimes it's quite challenging. Sometimes, emotions that we weren't aware of or traumas that have been suppressed start to come up, and they come up to be healed. And if we can stay present with the emotional intensity, if we can, be with what's happening without resisting it, then in a sense that's able to move, it's able to sort of be processed, and we come out the other side of that, even though it might have been quite an arduous and challenging experience, having processed some of that, and that again leads to really useful, really useful outcomes. If we resist it, if we get afraid of what's coming up, if we try to stop it, if we try to fight against it, that's where the problems occur. So some mindfulness meditation training is very useful, to make sure that we do it in the right mindset. If we've had a really busy, stressful, horrible week at work, and then it's Friday night, and then we're thinking maybe I take some psilocybin or something, that might not be the right time to do it. We might want to wait until we're in a better mental space. And then the setting is also really important. So that might include, being out in nature. You can take it in an apartment in the city. I mean, it's totally fine. A lot of people do that. Personally, I think being in nature is it augments the experience. It's a very powerful thing. And of course, we then connect more deeply with nature, feel our interconnectedness with the natural world. That's really good for our own psycho-spiritual health. It's also really good for the environment, for the climate, as we start to feel that interconnectedness. You want to make sure that you do it away from, I mean, people do it at music festivals and all kinds of things like that. I generally would recommend not doing that, particularly if it's a new experience. Do it in the countryside or somewhere, or in the park at least, with a trusted friend, someone who has experienced psychedelics before, and they'd want to be either microdosing or not using it at all, so that they can sit. They can be a sitter for you. So if anything negative is coming up, anything unpleasant, they can help to at least bring presence, keep you safe, ideally kind of guide you through it. And then out the other side of that, it's time for integration, because if we just take psychedelics and then go back to work on Monday, we've had a peak experience, but is that actually going to create any lasting, meaningful change for us? Well, probably not. I mean, we don't have solid research on this yet, but intuitively it would probably seem that that's not going to happen. Like if someone goes and does a 10-day meditation retreat or a 7-day meditation retreat, and then they come back and they stop meditating, that's, or if they go and do, a fitness retreat in some tropical island and drink smoothies every day and do yoga, and then they come home and just go back to work and eating chips on the couch. So it's really important to integrate. And that can be, and there are so many different practices that I recommend, and at Eudelics that we recommend. A daily meditation practice is really powerful. Journaling is really powerful. Spending time in nature, spending time with people who you can be authentic and real with, that's really, very helpful. So there are a range of things that can help us to integrate and take those insights and shifts forward. So that'd be, I mean, there's more. So download that cheat sheet if you like from our website if you're interested. But that's a pretty good snapshot of how you might do it safely. Or go and do it with with someone who knows what they're doing in a retreat setting somewhere. There are retreat centers popping up all over the world. There are programs that are being offered that might also be a really useful way to do it.
I think that's a very, very useful sort of rundown of the conditions one might consider taking psychedelics in, especially in the context where psychedelics are often thought of as primarily, perhaps, outside these kinds of circles, as a party drug for a festival. And when you're talking about the complexity of what goes on under the bonnet when you take it, it seems slightly mad that that's the case.
It's mad and it's a little bit sad, I think, because it does them a great disservice. That's when you lead to people ending up in the emergency room and adding to the wrong side of the empirical data. That's when, I mean, it's also, I guess it in some ways maybe cheapens the experience as well. Particularly, I mean, psychedelics, and particularly, they have so much to offer us, but they need to be used within, like we were talking about before, that container for them to give us their real benefits. And if we use them recreationally, having shrooms at a party or dropping some acid at a music festival, it can heighten the experience. And there's nothing inherently wrong with doing that. But it's unlikely that we're going to really draw the most benefit out of that psychedelic experience if we do it like that.
Yeah, it's funny. Like, I find that any intoxicants at all end up but they're levelers, right? So, like, I've definitely been to festivals where I've drunk too much, and the fact that I was at a festival I liked with music that I liked almost was irrelevant because I had drunk so much. Like, I could have been in my room with a couple of friends. The the variable of what I was actually doing became reduced because really I was just experiencing the intoxicant rather than experiencing the stimulus,
The event, yeah.
which, as you say, cheapens it slightly.
Yeah, I would agree. That's definitely my view. I mean, it's not. I don't want to demonize using psychedelics to heighten experiences. That can, of course, be fun, but I think that misses the point. And I would love to see personally psychedelics used in more and more of a sort of a reverent way, to hopefully help people to get profound insights into the nature of consciousness, or to heal trauma, or to heal psychological wounds, or to expand themselves, or to connect more deeply with their values, or to be able to connect more deeply with nature or other people. I think they're the ways that I would love people to be using them more and more.
But it just shows, right? With any powerful experience, there's potential. There's potential to use it in whatever way you like, and that's why the work you're doing is so interesting and so important, because there otherwise aren't necessarily guardrails. And if you have a very big, powerful tool, some guidelines tend to be helpful.
Usually, right? As you said, with anything that's taboo and suppressed in our society, whether it's sexuality or psychedelics, it has great potential for personal growth and development, great potential for harm. And therefore, the more that we find ways of encouraging people to use those things in safe, in safe containers, I think the better their sort of contribution to humanity is going to be.
Richard, where can everybody find you online?
So there are two places. They could Google drrichardchambers.com, drrichardchambers.com, or Eudelics, which is eudelics.com. Eudelics, the EU prefix, if you think of euphoria and euthymia, it means wellness, and the delics part of psychedelics means manifesting. So it's wellness manifesting, eudelics. So that'd be two places people could find me.
Richard, man, thanks so much for coming on and walking us through that. It's such a pleasure to chat to someone with an expertise in this area, because it's such a fascinating area, and it's all a little bit the Wild West without your kind of work.
It's definitely fascinating, and thanks for the questions. And it's also nice to talk to people who also have what's obviously a deep meditative and spiritual practice, and just to be able to sort of meld minds for a period of time. So thanks for having me on.
Brilliant. Well, that was the Contemplative Science podcast. I hope you enjoyed that half as much as I did. And as always, we'll see you next week.